Higher education in the form of physical universities that people go to has withstood the test of time for over a millennium. But the coming perfect storm of technologies, in particular artificial intelligence, leads to a situation that I believe could create the extinction of universities as we know them. And that potential troubles me greatly for the first, second, and third order consequences of what happens when universities disappear. So let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I have been thinking about this presentation for quite a while, actually. Months and months and months, if not over a year. And I've put off doing it and put off doing it and put off doing it. And I finally sat down and created a slideshow, starting off with this image, which will probably be the thumbnail. I'm not sure, but I think so. Anyway, the idea of a new way of doing kind of education and everything with a university in the background, potentially at midnight. Anyway, I have created something unusual for me, which is actually a slide deck a la Dave Shapiro. I wanted to stay really on topic, and I wanted to make this very clear, so even for somebody who's just sort of skimming it and watching this at high speed, you would be able to take away the important parts of this, because I feel this is very important. I'm considering this a clarion call to higher education, lower education, in other words, elementary school and high school and stuff. I also am very worried about, but I'm not in that game closely enough to really have a solid sense of how things are going to change in that. But in terms of higher education, things are going to change very rapidly. In fact, they already are changing. It's just that most universities are kind of like gigantic, aircraft carrier sized ships. They can't change course very quickly. And that lack of flexibility and agileness could be the death of universities as we know them. And while this has mostly to do with artificial intelligence, it actually all started with COVID back in 2020. COVID proved that remote education was indeed viable, in the sense that I was teaching classes sitting in my office at home, and students were wherever they were, probably at their houses, and we were carrying on the educational, endeavor together without having to be physically co-present. Now, did we lose a lot of things in that procedure? Yes, of course we did, and I'm going to talk about some of that stuff in terms of universities and the advantages they have, but the general course of education was still available, and it proved that there was no reason why this education had to take place in a localized environment. And of course, as one of my bullet points says down here, we are still using a medieval model in a digital age. In other words, universities as we know them were developed, somewhere around the turn of the last millennium, around 1000 of the Common Era. So that is a long time ago. And these universities, they had to exist in a physical form, and people had to come to them because they're, what else were you going to do? You're not going to do this by carrier pigeon or something. So people had to come to a localized place in order to get education. And that meant that repositories of knowledge, both in terms of human knowledge, like what people had in their brains, but also the knowledge that people had written down at first as monks, and then with the printing press in terms of printed documents, all of that kind of stuff resided in these places, and they became very special. But of course, the world in 2025 is extremely different than the world was in 1100. So is this model still viable? Well, that has been a question that people have been asking actually for decades, not just for a few years. But the criticalness of this question has really risen in terms of, again, COVID, we proved that we had the technology to do remote education, and of course, things like YouTube and stuff like that as well. But then especially generative AI, the capabilities of generative AI in the past 4 years have risen exponentially. They've been rising exponentially before that, but really, since 2020, 2021, things have risen in the public eye and in a practical sense at a very exponential rate. And at the same time, higher education costs have increased. I checked this 1,200%. That's not 120%. That's, 12x they've gone up since 1980. That is way past inflation. So it's becoming very expensive to afford, as people know who have, student loans. My older son, my 30-year-old son, finally paid off his student loans after 8.5 years, and he's actually ahead of the game. Many people are not even that far along. So, we're talking about something that is very expensive now because of the physical plant, because of the fact that you have to travel to it, because of the fact that things are localized. All of that kind of stuff is acting as a lever to really jack up the cost of education. And of course, in the United States, at least, the lack of public support. Public universities, the state used to bear the cost of public universities. They really don't anymore, at least not to the extent that they used to. And that creates a situation where the burden is passed on to us, the consumers, either us as the students or us as the parents of the students. And so it's become extremely expensive to become educated. It's a really big ask. And the question is always, is it worth it? That is the question. Is it worth going to university when it's going to cost this much, put most people into a significant amount of debt? Do they get the benefit benefit out of it that they expect to get out of it? Of course, historically, the answer has been yes, but with these new technologies and everything, that may no longer be the case. In fact, probably is not the case anymore for many, many people. As we start this journey that I wanted to be short, but I can tell it's going to be longer than I want it to be, I'm going to try to be as efficient as possible here because I want to get through all of this stuff. I want to use libraries as a microcosmic analog to what we're going to see at universities. So for those of us who are my age, 60 years old or something, we grew up with libraries. That's where you had to go. If you wanted information, there was no internet, there wasn't anything like that. You would go to a library, you would look up a book, you would read the book, you would find out that information, at least an alternative to going to a teacher and asking your teacher about something. But libraries existed like that, and they had existed like that for thousands of years. I mean, the Alexandria Library back in before the Common Era, those libraries existed over 2,000 years ago. That was a repository of knowledge, and that has continued on for millennia until after the 21st century came about. And then the importance of libraries really began to disintegrate because, of course, I can go on Google and find out about 90 to 95% of the information that I actually am interested in anyway. So the fact of the very expensive physical building, the employees that have to be there, housing the books, keeping them in good shape, purchasing the books, all of that stuff has become more of an anchor and less of a benefit. And that is a significant change in the world since I was young. If you were 20 or 25 years old, you wouldn't remember a time when libraries were the only place you could get information. But trust me, there was a time, and it was most of human history, where libraries were the only place you were going to get a significant amount of information clumped together. So anyway, if you want to think about the libraries as stores of knowledge, the interface to the database, in other words, the interface to all of that knowledge was the library itself, learning the Dewey Decimal System, going and walking around and looking at book jackets and things like that and journals and stuff. That was the interface to the database that was human knowledge. But as Andrej Karpathy has recently talked about in terms of coding and stuff like that, there is no need for an interface anymore because we can generate it ourselves. The interface to the library, by analogy, has become the internet instead. In fact, even if you want to go search your library, you're going to be doing it on a computer there if you don't do it at home. So you go on to like Galileo, and in my case, you go on to Galileo, which is attached to the university and all the other universities. You can search through journal articles, you can search through books, you can find what you want, and if they don't carry it at your library, you can order it, or even more likely get a PDF file of a scan of a couple of chapters or a journal article or something. So the interface has gone from being the physical plant, from being the library, to being just this, right? A screen in front of me. That's the physical. That's the interface now. It's no longer the same thing. And likewise, the interface to the database of knowledge that is education, in other words, the stuff that I teach to my students, that kind of a thing, that interface is changing right now. It's going from being the human interface to something else, to being an interface that's generated on the fly by large language models and other AI agents for us to consume as we will. And that really changes the very nature of education and what it means to be educated. And finally, before I continue, I want to talk about this bottom point. This is going to be a lumpy disruption, and I take no pleasure in it. The I take no pleasure part is pretty obvious. I do not wish this upon higher education. It's been the thing that I've been in my entire life since I turned 18 years old. I went to school and then I began teaching. In fact, I started teaching as a graduate student. So I was both a teacher and a student at the same time. And I love it. This is something that I really, really enjoy. And I think it's a wonderful environment. And so clearly I don't take pleasure in the fact that I'm talking about this stuff, but I think we all need to understand what's going to happen, because it will happen. And the second factor, it's going to be lumpy. It's going to be lumpy in terms of disciplines and also in terms of particular universities. So the universities part, it's going to affect smaller universities and probably smaller private universities more rapidly than the larger flagship universities, because those are the ones that are the most vulnerable. The flagship universities, right? The University of Georgia, there is a huge tradition of kids. Their parents went there, their grandparents went there. They want to go there. There is a real directive, and it's difficult to get into these universities now. It didn't used to be very difficult. 40 years ago, it was pretty easy. I think if you had a pulse, you got into UGA, but that's not the case anymore. So this is like the elite group of students from the state who are going to state school, going to this university. But the smaller state schools in Georgia and other states, those are the ones that could fall off the radar very, very quickly, and they could collapse. So that's one form of lumpiness. The other form of lumpiness is disciplinary lumpiness, and that I mean that probably STEM subjects like science, technology, engineering, math, those will probably stick around longer because people will see a value in it. Where they won't see a value will be the creative arts, the humanities, history, English. All of those topics will probably be very much under pressure to cut the faculty, to get rid of those disciplines entirely. And that makes me really sad as well, because I've always kind of worked in the intersection of the creative arts and the scientific arts, and it would make me extremely sad. I think we would lose as society, we would lose a huge, huge part of what makes being a human being beautiful if we lose access to the humanities, to the arts, all of that kind of stuff. So I see this happening, and I don't wish it to happen, but I think it will happen that way. All right, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty a little bit, the economic vulnerability of universities. There's a cross-subsidization model that goes on in universities where, different entities pay for different pieces of universities. It's actually quite complicated the way this all works together, and it takes quite a while to understand how all of this works. But we don't have to worry about the intricacies of this so much as just get the broad brush pictures here. And those broad brush pictures include large introductory courses that generate surplus revenue. In other words, per people sitting in that 500-seat classroom for intro to biology or theater appreciation or whatever the course is. Those generate a lot of revenue because you have one faculty member and one room, albeit a big room, and you generate a lot, a 500 students worth of credit, and that is quite a bit of money that gets generated by that class. This surplus, of course, affords the smaller classes, the 18-person classes, the 12-person classes, the graduate classes that can be very small, 5 or 6 people, something like that. It supports PhDs and master's students who teach some of these classes or teaching assist some of these classes, and they are therefore paid, and they're able to go to graduate school and get their degrees. And it also pays for the infrastructure, right? You got to pay for the buildings, got to pay for the maintenance, you've got to pay for the landscaping, you've got to pay for all the amenities like pools and gyms and all of that kind of stuff. So that surplus, the surplus of these extra large classes, is kind of what funds the pyramid of all the other things that are going on at a university. And then, of course, there are external funds as well. There's the state government that supports at least state schools. They provide some of the money that is available to state schools. Now, it used to be most of the money. It has gone way, way down in terms of state support. So it doesn't support nearly as much as it used to. And then private universities have, foundation funds from people who've graduated and put money in. So there's that kind of funding as well. And then, of course, there are national sources of funding. In other words, like NSF grants, National Science Foundation grants, or National Endowment for the Humanities grants, or whatever. And people can get those, and that also helps to support the university. So there's a lot of income sources that come in, but it's kind of a pyramid. And I don't mean this in a bad way, because you have relatively few PhD students at the top, but they're the ones who are really driving the value of the university because they go out into the world and hopefully make the most impact, both in terms of educating the next generation, but also in terms of discovering fundamental science or creating engineering breakthroughs or working in AI or, whatever that subject is. Those PhDs are relatively few, but very, very high value, and the rest of the structure supports them. But as you probably started thinking about when I talked about the large intro classes, those are the ones that are the most ripe for disruption. In other words, already through YouTube and other sources, you can get that same knowledge at a fraction of the cost. And with a hypothetical AI tutor that's suited just for you, you could learn exactly what you need in the style you need to learn it. You can learn the content of that class at a fraction of the cost, a marginal cost that's pretty close to zero. Not zero, you'll have to pay something for it, but as opposed to thousands and thousands of dollars per semester, it could cost you $10 or $50 or something along those lines. So much, much more affordable. And of course, when the revenue model collapses, the entire system fails. You don't have that base of that pyramid anymore, and everything else falls apart. And that's where the disruption comes in. So focusing down on master's and PhD students a little bit more, the research pipeline is at risk. And like I said, this is a relatively small group of students compared to undergraduates, but these are the ones who produce the most potential value to society. And so it's important not to lose this pipeline, and yet we are probably going to lose this pipeline. So PhD students are funded through teaching assistantships. In other words, they help teach the undergraduate students, or research assistantships. In other words, you get a National Science Foundation grant, and you can hire some students on to work for you that are paid through that grant. So one way or the other, they do that, or else they pay for it themselves. And that is more common in law school, in business school, in medical school. And those students take on huge debts, but then they're expected to make a very large amount of money once they come out. out. But for other subject areas, students are generally expected to be paid as they're doing this for doing some work to help the university. So that helps the student afford to be able to do this. It helps more students afford to be able to get master's degrees and PhDs. So it's very, very important. Anyway, these people become the future research leaders and knowledge creators. And this pipeline depends on undergraduate revenue and, of course, state and national revenue sources as well. But if those collapse, the PhD pipeline collapses, and what's at stake here is society's capacity to solve complex problems and keep pushing the sciences and the arts and the humanities forward as much as possible. I do not want to discount the PhDs and masters and MFAs and things in the fine arts and in the humanities. I think those are very, very important. My PhD is English literature. I did my dissertation on Samuel Beckett. So yes, I have a master's degree in artificial intelligence, and yes, I have an undergraduate degree in physics, but my PhD is actually in the humanities. And so, if anybody's going to defend that, I will, because I think it has had a profound influence on my life, and I would not trade that for the world. But my fear is that those areas, those subject areas, those disciplines will be most at risk. And of course, the thing that is going to put these at risk is going to be the 24/7, in other words, the always on teaching agent. In other words, a large language model or large multimodal model, something along these lines, that will act as your teacher, that will be able to teach you any subject you want in the form that you want. Some people may be more kinesthetic learners, in other words, more active learners. Others might want to read books. Others might want to have deep conversations, Socratic conversations, and you can have this, and it's personal with an AI tutor and with an AI professor, as opposed to having to go and a professor has a certain form of teaching, a way of teaching a class, and it's not one-on-one as well. And so you might not learn that effectively with that professor, and that creates a barrier to your learning. So you could get more efficient learning potentially out of this generative AI professor agent thing than you can in a university environment, and it'll cost a marginal amount of money on the order of $50 or $100 or something along those lines per class that you would take, as opposed to the thousands of dollars that it currently costs. And if people see this value proposition, they're going to be like, why the heck am I paying for a very expensive education that with a post-labor economics potentiality, right? I might not even get a job coming out of college. So why would I want to pay all this money, take on all this debt in order to not have a good job coming out and not even be able to pay off the debt? That is a serious question, and it's worth asking. So now we get to the first order consequences. First order are direct consequences that happen because of this. Number one, first order consequence is undergraduate students. Education will become primarily remote. This is my prediction. Of course, I'm predicting things. I can't know this for sure, but my prediction is that education will become primarily remote, and work will be too. I think that we're going to have fewer and fewer jobs where we have to go into an office building or something, at least not as full time. So those two things are going to happen together, and we will see education and work become more remote. But one drastically negative consequence of this is going to be that social aspects of education, that kind of stuff, is going to be, I think cauterized was a good word. It's going to be cut off, right? You're not going to have access to that social education, that social experience. Several of my best friends are from college, from that time period, and many of the most formative experiences of my life, including classes and late night conversations with friends and things like that, those happened during my college years and graduate school years, etc. And with primarily remote education, and especially with a one-on-one AI tutor where you're not even interacting with other members of a class or something, you're going to lose that social interaction, and that would be a devastating change to society. I don't think that's going to be to the good. I predict it will happen, but I think it will have devastatingly negative consequences. We saw a preview of this with COVID, and the kids that went to school during that time period had very, very severe negative consequences that we're only really now uncovering. Another first order consequence for undergraduates is it's going to return to being only for the rich. In Europe and the United States, up until about the end of World War II with the GI Bill, really education, this kind of education was only for the rich. And it was more of a polishing school, a connection school where you would make friends with people who are going to be, influential in society later on. You can see evidence of this in many, books by Hemingway or Fitzgerald from back in the early part of the 20th century. You can see how it was more of a social education. It was something where people would get together. I predict that that will continue. What you'll have is you'll have people who are well connected and well to do. They will want to continue this type of activity because the benefits are that you get to have social networks that are very influential, and you can then continue on to dominate society at a later point in time. So I think that will happen, but there's a very, very small amount of people who are wealthy enough to afford to do something like this because they want to. So the need for universities that has grown over the past 80 years is going to completely collapse. And there will be a much smaller need for universities than there currently are, which is going to lead to a collapse of universities. And then, as I said, ironically, this is back to that medieval education. It's not for the common man, but for the rich person. And so that's, I mean, take that as it will. I don't think that's a positive consequence, but that is, I believe, a consequence of what's going to happen. On to the first order consequences for the university itself. There will be a faculty crisis. In other words, why do we need faculty if we don't have universities anymore? There's going to be a shift from information delivery to mentorship. I think that we're going to see faculty move from just spouting information to students to becoming more mentors. We're already seeing that happening. The outside of class stuff is very important for what we do now. And the university, UGA, where I teach, the University of Georgia, is attempting to integrate that into our evaluations. How well do we mentor students? That's becoming very, very important. And of course, going forward, as part of this, we must, as faculty and a university, articulate what value we bring beyond what AI provides. And with AI eating more and more of the pie, what is the value we're going to bring? I don't know, right? Some possibilities are we can focus on the uniquely human capabilities. I personally don't know that that is I don't know that that's going to hold for the long term, because it's something that might work for the first couple of years, but what if AI gets better and better and better? Will we have any unique capabilities anymore? I'm not sure. But certainly, knowledge transfer in quotes is no longer going to justify the position. We can't just be the lecturers. A lecture class is not worth the time for the student. They could learn faster and more efficiently through a LLM professor. And then the very unfortunate consequence of this is we're going to see a major faculty culling. We're going to see, universities begin to disappear or at least shrink way, way down. And that's going to lead to massive cuts. And the best place to cut is young faculty. In other words, faculty that have just come on board and have no job protections or anything at this point, and especially faculty that are getting a PhD or something like that and haven't even gotten a job yet. You just don't hire new faculty. You let the faculty disappear, right? They retire out and you just don't replace them. And that causes the university to shrink, but it means that there's no longer a pipeline. Those younger faculty no longer have a place to go in academia. And that will devastate the future, because what you're going to do is have an aging faculty with nobody there to replace them, because once students find out there's nowhere to go, they're going to go someplace else. They're going to get a different kind of degree, something along those lines. And you're going to have a massive, massive shortfall. So at first, you're going to have a glut of people that want a job and can't find it. And then once they realize there's no jobs, they'll go elsewhere, they'll do something else. And then there's going to be a massive shortage of faculty later on down the road. So that, I would consider that a second order consequence, not a first order, but it ties directly to this first order consequence. Continuing with first order consequences, graduate students, I'll cover this a little more quickly since we've talked about this already, but graduate education will have a funding crisis. Teaching assistant positions, and to some extent research assistants as well, although I think less of that, but certainly teaching assistant positions will vanish as AI handles that instruction, especially for those intro courses. And emergency measures like endowments, grants, etc. will only temporarily help. And then you'll see departments having to choose research output, cohort size. What can these departments afford? What is the cohort that they need, the minimum cohort of students to make a viable graduate program? Will they be able to do that? Will they have to remove that graduate program entirely and look a different direction? Those things are very difficult questions that the departments are going to have to think about like soon, right? And then the apprenticeship model that is right now, that's what happens. You have a PhD student who kind of works with a faculty member or multiple ones and learns how to do the PhD thing. Well, that's going to require a complete reimagining. What that's going to turn into, not quite sure, but it's going to require a reimagining. More first order consequences, the curriculum itself. Traditional testing will become meaningless when AI provides the answers and provides a different way of learning. I already have moved moved very, very far away from testing. It's not my thing. I don't like to test students. We do project-based stuff almost entirely in my classes already. But I think that testing sort of metric, that sort of traditional way of measuring how well a student does is going to go out the window because it's just not going to be the way students learn anymore. And so what will happen is we'll get a shift to competency-based education rather than test-based education, and project-based and experiential learning will become central because that's, number one, something we can do physically, which says, hey, there's a value to the university. And number two, it gives the potential workers, right? Students going out into the work world, it gives them more real world experience, more direct experience that will help them when they get out. And then we can try to focus on what AI doesn't do well. The problem, of course, is it might do this well in another year or another 5 years. So at least at this point, ethics, creativity, hands-on kind of stuff, those sort of areas, at least currently, are areas that humans do much better than AI. So that at least temporarily might help, but I don't know what will happen in the next 5 or 10 years. So it could become a situation again where the pie that humans can do that AI can't do is going to shrink and shrink and shrink. The piece of the pie is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And so we're going to be living in the margins if that's the case. So I think a reimagining is going to be better, but at least in the near term, those are some arguments that we can make as higher education faculty. And then finally, for first order consequences, we get to administration. The bloat in the middle of all universities is massive. It's one of the reasons why the cost is so high. That's going to go away, right? There's an arguable necessity for that now. I don't personally buy it myself, but you can make an argument for why that bloat is needed in the middle, but it's absolutely not going to be needed when AI is taking over the bulk of education. Certainly, you won't need nearly as many admissions people. You won't need as much curriculum. You won't need as much assessment. You won't need as much, external stuff like, student life kinds of things like that when you don't have as many students, when you don't have as big a campus, all of that kind of stuff. I would also throw in here, I didn't put in here, but the physical plant of the university as well will need to shrink. It's not going to need to be as big anymore because students won't, even if they come part-time, they're probably not going to come full-time anymore. So you can reduce the size of the campus and make it significantly smaller and cheaper to operate. And so my prediction is there's going to be a major culling of mid-level administration at universities to remove the cost and redundancy. I hear a lot of people probably cheering that. Again, I'm not taking any pleasure in this. I'm just predicting what's likely to happen. Then we move on to second order consequences. First of all is institutions. So we'll get an institutional stratification. This is that lumpiness. Elite universities will insulate their doctoral programs and themselves through their endowments. If you've got billions and billions of dollars in endowments, you can insulate yourself and you can keep going, whereas other institutions will be unable to. Mid-tier institutions will face enrollment declines and budget crises for sure. That's already happening. And then research capacity will concentrate in fewer and fewer institutions, which will, again, separate the elite, the rich elite people who can afford this from the masses. The masses just are going to lose access to education like this, and it's going to be, even if you want that education, it won't be available to you unless you're wealthy. If you don't want it, if you prefer an AI professor, AI tutor, then great, you'll be able to do that, but you're going to lose that capability. And of course, as I say at the bottom, the gaps between the haves and the have-nots will widen dramatically. The next second order consequence is research. The research model is going to have to be transformed. So as we've seen, AI accelerates data analysis. It is the new interface. It's the growing interface for data. The human pipeline, what we do and what's magical about us, is going to narrow in scope. And humans, as we already are going to start to become more controllers, more high-level, managers of these AIs rather than actually doing the fundamental research as much ourselves. There's advantages and disadvantages to that. There's definitely something we lose, but we also have lost things with a calculator, right? We aren't as good at doing math in our heads anymore because we can just use a calculator and do some basic math. So you can argue whether that's good or not, but that's probably what's going to happen. We'll almost surely see increased industry partnerships, which will shift research priorities. Again, good and bad. It's going to be helpful to have a lot of money from these companies, but companies expect something out of this, very, very specific. That means that fundamental research that doesn't have a direct implication for that industry, for that business, could be cast out to the wolves, and that's going to be very unfortunate. And of course, the free inquiry model that we have, which is you get a grant and you do the research and you discover what you discover and you publish what you discover, good, bad, indifferent, whatever you want to say about climate change or, economics or whatever that kind of thing is. Those things at least are relatively free right now. That could easily be compromised if, say, an oil company is funding your research, which has happened historically, of course. I'm not making this up. This has happened many times, but this has become more and more the norm. If they're funding you, it's going to be difficult for you to say, wow, oil is the cause of human climate change, gases and things like that. They're not going to be happy about giving you money for that. So you're going to be pushed, whether explicitly or implicitly, towards findings that are more beneficial to the people who are funding you. So that is a very definite negative consequence, that free inquiry will be reduced. As I mentioned earlier, we also have facilities. The physical campus is very expensive at this point. We could see lecture halls repurposed for collaborative things and specialized facilities, a focus on spaces for experiences, like physical experiences that AI can't replicate, at least not now. Again, once we get robots out there, then all bets are off. Of course, the infrastructure that's currently designed for this current different model creates a financial burden, and we will almost definitely see university footprints shrink significantly. They will get rid of a lot of off-campus stuff, then they will start shrinking the campus itself and selling off pieces of the property and things like that to stay afloat. So the the physical plant is likely to shrink significantly along with the student body going down. And now we get to third order consequences that I hadn't thought about too much until recently, but I've started to kind of mourn for Athens, Georgia. Athens is very much a college town. The university is the center of, there's about 55,000 students and 10,000 faculty and staff that are at the university. That is the dominant source of the economic livelihood of this town. But once that goes away, if it really shrinks down, if there's not nearly as many students anymore, what happens to the restaurants? What happens to the hospitals? What happens to the housing market? All of that kind of stuff. These smaller university towns could face significant challenges. And it's not just the retail spending, the restaurants, the housing markets, etc., but even the cultural vitality of the town itself could be at risk. And of course, the tax base will collapse as well, because if you have fewer faculty, if you have fewer students paying for rent and things like that, all of that reduces the tax base, which reduces the wealth that's available to the town to do things. And therefore, I'd say that economic diversification immediately is really, really critical for these towns to survive. They need to start thinking about themselves not as university towns, but as towns that have universities in them. And what else can they do to diversify away from those universities? Specialized fields, in fact, I think all fields will experience expert shortages of people who know what they're doing, the people with advanced degrees and everything. Humanities and theoretical sciences could be brutally hit. They could just be devastated. And that creates, again, a consequence. It's a first order consequence that it's immediate and it happens, but the third order consequence is that over time, over decades, we lose that capacity because the people who knew that kind of thing are dead. They've retired, they've died, etc. So you don't have access to that anymore. That is a gigantic hit to humanity, to society as a whole. That's a really significant problem. And of course, the irony of all of this, the AI is supposed to give us all access to all of the knowledge in the world, but we could see a consequence of this over time is that democratized access to knowledge could be offset by barriers to creating the new knowledge. We can't create new knowledge as efficiently as we used to. Now, maybe the AI will be able to do it and discover new science, but we haven't seen that yet. And even if it does, is it going to discover the same things that humans do? I don't know. I think over time, we're going to see a real reduction in the quality of knowledge that's being generated. And that makes me very, very sad, because I love thinking about humanity always discovering new things and, working at the edge. And I think that could easily go away. And of course, on a more practical level, we could easily have knowledge gaps in fields that require specialized training. And then the final third order consequence is actually global, thinking globally or thinking about globalism. Global competition and social development, they're going to really significantly alter because of this change. Because most countries have taken over this European university idea, right? That's how they educate their students. But many will not be able to afford to continue this education versus the much less expensive AI education. So countries that are rich enough, that are able to maintain doctoral funding will gain a big advantage over poorer countries. Again, the haves and the have-nots will bifurcate more. There's going to be a brain drain from regions where universities contract, as opposed to towns and cities that have access to a lot of very intelligent people. That will diffuse across the world, and that could have negative or positive positive consequences. I think there will be some negative consequences because I think, putting people together who think alike like that can have some very major advantages. People can argue with me on that point or not, but anyway, I think it will be more negative than positive. We will also see the traditional socialization role of universities, diminish significantly. It will go back to being a polishing tool for the wealthy people that can just afford it, and they'll have a good time. It's like somebody compared it to like a cruise ship, very expensive cruise ship with a lot of socialization activities. It could go more that direction, and that would be very, very unfortunate, but that seems like a distinct possibility for where things could go. And then what we might see instead is more ad hoc institutions that emerge for professional identity formation and for students to learn very, very specific topics and silo their knowledge. I think another consequence is we could have siloed knowledge. One of the beauties of liberal arts education is that you're required to take a broad base of different topics, even things you're not interested in, and those have an effect on you later in life. And so if you're able to educate yourself outside of a university context, and do it in a way that you only focus on what you're interested in at the time, there's a good chance that you're going to lose that sort of broader based understanding of the world, and that would be unfortunate as well. Okay, so that's a lot of downer stuff, right? So let's talk about some solutions. I've got at least some ideas for what we might be able to do here. Number one, educational skunk works is needed. We need a coalition of visionary leaders that are just freed from this bureaucratic, like I said, giant battleship type of, entity that is these universities. Something very, very lean, something that can kind of reimagine from first principles what education is in an AI era, what needs to be taught in person, what needs to be kind of physically co-located, what can be done in a non-physically co-located way. Just really, really think about it, clean sheet type of thing. And then prototype new models that integrate this technology and integrate it in a way that's successful for students and can teach them as effectively as possible, but not lose some of the things that I was talking about, the first, second, and third order consequences. And that requires a focus on the essential functions of knowledge creation. And as I say here, just as an aside, if anybody has the money, time, etc., I am happy to participate in this. I've already given this quite a bit of thought and would love to talk to you about that. So definitely hit me up on X or, in the comments, or just email me, whatever. We can then turn to new funding models as part of the solution. So terminal degree funding model changes. We could have research training endowments specifically for graduate education that are not tied to specific companies, but are maybe a collection of companies that put money in, so that we can divorce people from feeling like they have to produce results that are, specific to that company that funded them and make that company happy. That would be a good thing to create a little bit of separation like that. Federal support framing the PhD pipeline as a critical infrastructure would also be useful. Will that happen in the current circumstances? Really, really doubtful, but that would be really helpful if the federal and state government said, this is a critical industry. This is something that we consider to be as important as defense, as things like that, because honestly it is. If you don't have these people coming out at this level of education, you don't get a lot of the solutions that you need to keep moving your society forward. And then of course we could look at inter-university consortia that are sharing specialized resources together. So in other words, you still have the kind of physical plant of the university, but it becomes a node in a system of universities. So rather than thinking about it as a university, it becomes a system. And so students can take different classes across those universities, some of them remote, some of them in person. You can move between the universities. You can share resources. So some university nodes could specialize more in the fine arts or something, and some could specialize more in physics or chemistry or whatever, right? So you could see how universities could become more diffuse, more diversified across physical and internet space. More solutions are we can think about AI as a multiplier. So in other words, we could have AI accelerating human research instead of replacing it. AI tools could amplify graduate student productivity. It could be a collaborator, an accelerator, not a competitor. With reduced need for direct teaching, especially those larger classes, there could be a reallocation from teaching to research time, which would make faculty more efficient, right, at producing new research. So that could be a really interesting solution. We can also focus on problems requiring human creativity and ethics, and think about how we can interact with the AI, again, as a collaborator, not a competitor. And then instead of the traditional faculty-student relationship, we can start thinking about it as a triangle. Faculty-student AI collaboration models. What those would look like, not quite sure, but it's an interesting idea. And then finally, we get to how does a university express its value in this new world? We need to redefine the value for the stakeholders. Stakeholders are the students, parents of the students, the faculty, staff, etc., and of course, the society at large, the state, the nation, etc. So the human connection and mentorship, that's a good value. That's something that I don't think AI is going to give us anytime soon. Community and identity formation are critically important as well. Specialized facilities access. In other words, you can't just build a chemistry lab or something or a big giant server cluster in your basement. You need access to these advanced facilities. And so being able to travel to these places, to access them, to educate yourself based around these things, that will be critically important. Not everything happens in front of a computer screen, even today and even into the future. So access to those specialized facilities will be critically important. And then thinking cross-disciplinarily across the disciplines, integrating all of these different disparate things through human wisdom, again, with a human kind of thinking about this from a high level and probably tasking AIs to do the kind of work that's necessary as an intermediary or a collaborator with the students and the faculty. So again, it goes back to that sort of triangle instead of just a line back and forth between the faculty member and the student. So in the end, is there hope? Well, things are going to get painful. Absolutely. Many institutions will not survive, at least in their current form. The big question is, should they, right? As after World War II with the GI Bill and everything, in the United States at least, education blew up. Higher education became very, very, very large. It became quite the significant industry. And that industry is moving under its own momentum right now. And the question is, should it survive in its current form? Probably not in its current form. Should it survive? Absolutely. I think society needs it. Does it need to change? Absolutely. That's a painful truth. Very importantly, incremental adaptation is not going to be sufficient. It's going to require reinvention. So in other words, that giant battleship or aircraft carrier can't turn slowly. It's not going to be fast enough. It's got to be reimagined and it's got to be done quickly. And then finally, we're going to need new models, some sort of hybrid model, probably something that's partially localized, partially physically localized, and partially remote or electronically based. It's probably going to require something along those lines and some creativity in terms of how that will actually be instantiated. And the countries and states and universities that act on this the quickest are the ones that are going to not just survive, but thrive in this new era. So I'll end with, what do we need to do? First of all, nice quote, the future belongs to those who create it. I think that's very apropos of this discussion. We need to demand honest assessments of what exceeds AI's capabilities and what doesn't, and what that means today versus next year versus 5 years from now versus 10 years from now. We can't just kind of run around and try to solve the problem that exists today. We need to think 5, 10, 15 years out into the future and say, what does AI not deliver us today? And what does it deliver us? What do we get out of it and what do we not get out of it today, but also likely in 5 years and 10 years, etc. That's where we need to be going. We also need to really, really protect the doctoral education pipeline. I know I keep harping on this and probably a lot of people are like, we don't need that. But those are the people who make the fundamental discoveries, right? It's not everyone. Yeah, there's high school dropouts that do that. But to a large extent, the people who make the fundamental discoveries are the ones coming out of the education system with PhDs, with terminal degrees, who are able to think at a very high level about what's going on and come up with new techniques and help change the world. As I mentioned before, we need to form resource sharing consortia. That's very, very important. We need to think about this as a node-based thing rather than a siloed monolithic entity sort of model. We as society absolutely need to advocate for government and private support that is specifically dissociated from profit-driven results. Otherwise, you're just working for a company at that point. It may be indirectly, but if it's a profit-driven result, then you're working for that company, right? So it needs to be dissociated from that. I'm not saying no responsibility. You can do whatever you want with no consequences. That's not what I'm talking about, but it needs to be dissociated from specific profit-driven motives, because you need to be able to do that fundamental research without the constraints of a company breathing down your neck and saying, hey, are you getting the results that we wanted? That's not the kind of fundamental research we need to move society forward. And then last but not least, we need to experiment boldly. We need to, take that aircraft carrier, break it apart into a whole bunch of little speedboats, run around and see what happens and which direction direction is the right direction to go in, and then we can kind of recast and move that way. Now, will we ever create these giant battleship / aircraft carrier universities again? I doubt it. I think, at least if society keeps going the way we are, if we go back to a medieval time, things go backwards, if we revert in society, then yeah, that's what's going to happen. In fact, I hope it happens. Otherwise, we'll go way back to the Dark Ages, and that would be even worse. But assuming that society continues moving forward, universities as we know them are going to look very, very archaic, and we're going to need to be very adaptable to the future and redefine what higher education means. Alrighty, folks, so that was my 15-minute presentation. I started off with, I was like, I can do this in 15 minutes. I was like, nope, not going to happen that fast. Anyway, I wanted to lay out the case here. I wanted to talk about all of these consequences. Please let me know what you think in the comments about not only what I have to say here. Feel free to disagree with me about any of the points or the overall object of what I'm saying, but also I would love to know what your thoughts are about how do we solve these problems? How do we make higher education viable moving forward into the 21st century? How do we do that? Also, while you're down there, if you don't mind liking the video so other people can find it, that would be amazing, because I think this is an important video. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.